Welcome everyone to another edition to As Above, So Below Radio. I'm your host, Martin Hodgson, and it gives me great pleasure to have you tuning in today. When you get a chance, please visit the newly revamped website holisticadvocate.com. For any updates on news as well as interviews, please visit my blog. Also, take a moment to subscribe and become a member. Not only will you gain access to the commercial-free, subscriber-based interviews, but also treat yourself to an assortment of fascinating people worth listening to. Today's guest is Scott Stevens. Scott is an award-winning television weatherman who had his awakening moment when he began investigating claims that the weather in North America was being purposely engineered. His investigative pursuit, through the use of time-lapsed photography, led him to discover that the skies were being sprayed with chemtrails. Currently, Scott is a co-principal of a company called Blue Water Alchemy. When time permits, Scott can also be found on the lecture circuit helping to raise consciousness. Join me in welcoming Scott as he discusses the geoengineering of the planet. First of all, Scott, I want to extend to you a warm welcome for being on As Above, So Below Radio. Now, Scott, you are considered a traditional weatherman whose job was to report and track the weather, kind of like following the script, so to speak. So, what made you summon the courage and the conviction to tell the people about the, quote, elephant in the room, unquote, and talk about chemtrails and the geoengineering of the planet?
Oh boy, well that's kind of loaded because I didn't realize there was an elephant in the room for the longest time, Martin. I just didn't. I saw what was going on, but I didn't know what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Is it natural? Is it unnatural? Is it this boogeyman CO2 gas in the atmosphere that's causing all the problems, or is it something else? And though that's not something that you're not given a class at in school or is talked about on the nightly news, it's just weird weather and it's climate change, and you have to accept the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I just, something with that just didn't sit right. My understanding of meteorology is very classical. Trained, at the University of Kansas when I went to school, and what they teach is pretty much what is taught in every school around the country, or the globe for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But 10, 15 years into it, there was an accuracy that I was struggling with. I have an audience that for 3 times a night at 5, 6, and 10 o'clock would choose to watch me. And, I want to, give them the best forecast, possible. And it was in the late 90s that I just began struggling. And I was noticing that the guys in Washington, D.C., at what is now termed the Weather Prediction Center, the WPC, were struggling with their accuracy as well, and in particular with storms coming in off the Pacific. And so it was all winter long, all winter 98, 99, 2000. They were just, the models were having difficulty. The simulations about what the weather would do, the models, were just struggling out of the Pacific and the western U.S. And I'm like, come on now. This is the 21st century. This is weather. How hard can it be? And so that, let's just say, put a chink in my armor for defending the mainstream, defending that which is the common path. Because there was something wrong, there was something missing. And so I began or continued my research into free energy. That's really what brought me down this hole was trying to find a solution to petroleum. It's a 100-year-old, 150-year-old technology. It's just got to be done. It's outlived its usefulness, and all of the economic crises that are in our hunger for energy has caused us and this planet. It was untenable to continue. And so this is what I'm researching. And I happened to be on Lieutenant Colonel Bearden's website, Cheniere.org, CHENIERE.org, and it was about magnetic motionless motors. And so I'm like, how do we get this technology from the inventor's workbench to be deployed, and how do we, which one of these inventions is going to do it? Is it the car engine that runs on water? Is it the geek motor? What is it going to be? And so That's what I was gaming and trying to get around in my head. And then in his site there was a page, and it was essentially titled Soviet Weather Engineering. And I'm like, ooh, this is fascinating. And in that story that Colonel Bearden told in 1976, it was the culmination of essentially 20 years of research, as the Russians were a little bit freaked out, and Stalin in particular, with the rapidity that Americans were building A-bombs, nuke bombs, hydrogen bombs, neutron bombs. We were building bombs. We were splitting apart the atom like it was nobody's business. And so that kind of had the Russians concerned. And so he told his scientists, get me something the Americans don't have. What don't they have? And we were building explosions, and they went on the other side. They went into the esoteric. They went into implosions, and they leveraged the work of Nikola Tesla, Victor Schauberger, and they ended up with a program called energetics, and it allowed them to direct energy and to accomplish action at a distance. And this action at a distance can be the removal of heat from a zone in the atmosphere, which will increase the instability of a layer of the atmosphere and aggressively develop a storm, or the inverse. You deposit heat in a storm and thereby reducing its ability to generate the rain droplets that will then fall out of the sky, and you can kill a storm. And that's what I was seeing. That's what I was struggling with in the 90s and the first part of the last decade, was these storms that should have been but were not. And time again, this storm would come in, it looks good on satellite imagery, the models are generating snow, and then nothing would happen. We would get a trace, we would get less than an inch, the mountains would get a quarter, a third, a fifth of what they should have received, and a drought would emerge. And this was happening with storm after storm. And it really wasn't until I got deeper into how do I even say this? Reading the satellite imagery, discerning what was happening, and matching what was happening on the ground with what I was seeing from space. And by 2004, I'd kind of worked the kinks out of that. And I could, well, Martin, what that did when it came to forecasting was I had learned to forecast the extremes. If we were in a drought, then that trend was your friend, and you under-forecast the snow, the rain, whatever it was coming at you, with that agenda in place, with that pattern in place. And if it was a wet pattern, then you'd go to the same extreme. You would over-forecast the event. And I just found that worked best. I kind of came into that in the early 90s when I was working in Tulsa, and it's worked for me ever since. I didn't know why. But 10, 15 years later, I kind of figured out that it's because this engineering has been going on since, according to Colonel Bearden, the mid-'70s. Up until 1976, this planet was headed into an ice age. Then all of a sudden, when geoengineering gets underway, it's climate change, it's global warming, it's CO2. All of these issues are the CO2 in particular is causing this warming of the planet that wasn't an issue until the 1980s when the engineering began. So I had a lot of different agendas to try to sort out in my head, and that took the better part of a decade. It just did.
Okay, now, is it your understanding that, most of these pilots spraying these chemtrails actually understand what they're doing? Or is it your understanding that they're being kept in the dark?
I believe we have maybe 2.5 fleets of aircraft up there. One is the regular commercial planes. We see them doing what they've got to do. On a schedule, getting cargo, be that passengers or another kind of inanimate payload, from point to point. And these airports are busy. These planes have got to be on the ground in the landing pattern to the minute. And they take off at a precise minute so they can, be in flight at a very, let's just say, expedient pace so they don't burn too much fuel, and then get their passengers, on the ground safely. And so what I see with these planes that are doing the chemtrails is they're up there investigating anomalies in the clouds, anomalies in other trails. And you cannot do that if you have to have that plane on the ground across the country in 4 hours and 14 minutes. You just can't go up there willy-nilly dodging around, hitting these other atmospheric targets. And so we've got 2 fleets. And there's absolutely no reason No reason whatsoever that there has to be a pilot on board this other fleet. One less paycheck, one less mouth to talk.
Mm-hmm.
So the planes can go up and robotically do what they need to do, and they've been able to do that for 40 years. 40 years we've had these planes that can fly automatically, can land themselves, and so forth. The military worked that out with their carrier landings a long time ago. So there may be the pilots that are up there and see some of these things happening, see the odd shapes, but I'm sure if they want to keep their jobs, they'll shut up.
Well, yeah, you know what perks my mind here is that there's a vast amount of money that's involved in doing this, in spraying these chemtrails into the atmosphere. And so, I begin to question, where's the accountability in all this? If the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, can spot a $300 expense for a toilet, coming from the Pentagon, why can't they hint or publicly admit to the glaring expense of this chemtrail campaign? I mean, the money's coming from somewhere, right?
Yeah. And this is where our money system, with a fractional reserve, fiat-based system, you can have an explosion of the money supply on the black ops side, and then the money supply can stay relatively stable on the public side. If we truly had to use national treasure to do what the United States government and the military-industrial complex and whoever else is doing these actually had to go to the open market and sell gold, silver, dimes, platinum, oil, our natural resources, none of this would have happened. It's only because we have a profoundly funny money system that we can do this.
Right.
As long as Boeing will take $200 million for an airplane, Airbus will take $200 million for an airplane, Cessna will take $20 million for an airplane, as will Gulfstream and all these other aircraft manufacturers, Dow Chemical, and all these other chemical companies coming up with the ingredients for these trails, plus the computers, plus the satellites, plus the launch capability to get into space, plus the ground-based operations, plus the pilots to fly them, remotely in the chairs. I mean, this is not a small operation. It is not a small operation by any stretch of the imagination, and it would not be possible if we had to pay for it with real money. The day before 9/11, we've got our lovely Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, up there, 9-10 months into office. The Bush was in office, and so he was, freshly in office as well. And he's having a press conference telling it, hey, the Defense Department is magically missing $2.1 trillion. In 2000, their budget was not $400 billion. So we're talking about, 3-4 times their annual budget. It's gone. It's gone. And so it's the money system. And if we had honorable leadership come back into place, we would have the Federal Reserve gutted of its authority and essentially just shuttered. And then, the process of minting and issuing money would then come from Congress. And then the Government Accountability Office may have some line item or chapter that would outline this program. And until we can bring these things in from the black ops, we'll never know how much they really cost. We're always inferring, we're looking at inventory, we're anticipating or guessing at operational costs, when really we don't know how big the program is. When we've got, the skies of Australia draped in trails, and now they're into South America in the last 5 years. Of course, this continent from Panama to the North Pole is covered with it, as is the North Pacific, North Atlantic, Europe, and of course the Middle East, where we've, exerted our influence.
Well, you've also documented chemtrails done by ships, right? That's something new.
Well, it is, and that's something that is very easy to see on visible imagery from space, especially the 1 and 4 kilometer resolution stuff. You can see those trails, and they are displaying the same behavior as the trails in the sky are. They're laying out a pattern, and then these patterns deform. They break, they squiggle, they bend, they tear, and other ships come along and move through those exact spots. So there's something happening on a small scale that they are outlining, that they are signaling is happening. And I really believe what is happening is dimensional in nature. And whether that is, as Bearden calls it, a scalar energy, or something a little more refined, an etheric or an Orgon field. And I think the powers that be And the intelligences that they derive their knowledge from are fully aware of these spheres, these sources of energy. And that's why they have been, reticent to tell the public, oh yeah, we've got free energy. Oh yeah, we've got time travel. Oh yeah, we've got these things.
Mm-hmm.
Because once they're acknowledged, then we're truly in the 21st and 22nd century.
Mm-hmm.
Man will have moved forward. These science fiction of the last 50 years very quickly becomes science fact. And there's still 7 billion people on this planet, and a lot of them are low vibration beings. Let's just put it that way.
Right.
And so maybe that needs to be cleaned up before the goodies to the kingdom are revealed.
Yeah, for the most part, they don't just look up at the sky and see what's going on. I mean, they're just pretty much immersed in their careers and paying the mortgage. How am I going to get through this month, from paycheck to paycheck? So yeah, it's being, cleverly orchestrated, so to speak, so that everyone just doesn't question, what's happening beyond the perceived reality, that we, look, the world at. But this is peculiar, Scott. You talked about resonant geometry and the appearance of a pentagram. I think it was during the appearance of Hurricane Isabel in 2003. Can you talk more about this?
Well, I think resonance is the primary tool that they use to shape or sculpt the weather. And the atmosphere is a gas, the oceans are a fluid, and they should have, let's just say, a uniformity in their appearance. Things should be rounded, curls, fluids. Gaseous fluids. That's a free-flowing fluid. Mm-hmm. But that's not what we're finding, and this is where Colonel Bearden's work really was enlightening for me. Was that some of the photography on his site showed resonant geometric grids, radials, cubes, and odd kind of patterns. And I looked at the pictures and I'm like, well, I've kind of seen this, maybe. But it was shortly after that I bought my first digital camera, and this is 14 years ago. And once I started framing the sky, framing the clouds, doing landscape photography, then all of these shapes just screamed at me. The sky was unnatural, and yet the landscape, the profile of the earth was then natural. And so it was odd to see the geometry in the sky and then, a mountain silhouette. It was just a little bizarre. And so it was that kind of photography that in about 4 years' time I was utterly and absolutely convinced that we were subject to gross, profound, and almost utterly complete manipulation of the weather. And so they're introducing these resonances, probably partially, if not mostly, from the aircraft themselves. These pulses go in the sky, and they need these straight lines to act as boundaries where a counter wave can be introduced into the atmosphere, or a complementary wave can be introduced into the atmosphere to cancel out what was happening inside this other zone. And so the trails are good at aligning boundaries and also for aligning the introduction of these waves to accentuate weather patterns or to inhibit their development. And so just the trails and the planes being up there, you can't tell, or I can't tell, if it's going to accentuate a storm's development or inhibit. All I can see is that the action is happening. And only when the event is over, when it's complete, can you see, their impact on the sum total. And so that was my frustration, on the air, was, okay, I see what's happening, but I'm not forecasting the natural processes of this planet anymore. I'm left trying to anticipate, what the agenda is for this particular storm over my location. Mm-hmm. And that's not something we're trained in school. There is no Met, 505 for that. There isn't. So that's the main reason why most weathermen get it wrong, and why I got it wrong, is that we're not forecasting the natural processes of this planet anymore as we are taught that we're doing in school.
Well, let me ask you this, Scott. In all your years in forecasting the weather to the public and so forth, was there ever a moment where you knew you were crossing some boundaries that let's say your employers and so forth, other people that were involved, told you to be mindful of what you do and don't worry about what's up there?
Only once,
Uh-huh.
and it was more of a self-check than anything.
Uh-huh.
Because I had pretty much had carte blanche at my station.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been there 10 years, and for 9 years that I was there, we were number one. We're tied for number one.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I left, they slipped to a distant second, and it's been there ever since. And so I could do pretty much what I wanted to do because I was responsible for millions of dollars of revenue to the newsroom a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so that my general manager said, Scott, you can do what you need to do. Don't talk, don't bring it to our station, but you can do your interviews. You can do all those things on your own time.
Mm-hmm.
But when I truly initiated the essentially going public, coming out of the closet on this, I wrote up a 5-page letter, included some photographs, and sent it to George Ure from urbansurvival.com. Mm-hmm. Because he had asked his readership in late 2004, were all these hurricanes that impacted Florida the result of some scalar weather engineering? And I'm like, oh, this is just a perfect door to open. This is what I need to answer. Mm-hmm. And so I spent 2 or 3 hours writing that up, and before I sent it, I knew I'd lose my job. Mm-hmm. I knew it.
Right.
But because that was going to be the eventual outcome. What I didn't know is how long it would take. And Martin, I was already a little antsy. Mm-hmm. I was getting bored. I was ready to do something else. Mm-hmm. I'd been almost 20 years doing this, and 20 years of the same.
Right.
And I was ready to do something else. And so that probably that prompting, that itchiness to get on with life and on to another adventure was what let me be okay with getting let go.
Right. So. Okay. Well, I want to switch now and talk about silts. Is it your understanding that the sky elementals are in battle with these agencies spraying these chemtrails to clean up the toxicity in the atmosphere? I mean, it's almost as if these covert agencies are spraying these chemtrails to observe the reaction of these silts, similar to how a scientist would observe a microbe under a microscope if given an outside stimuli. Because I've noticed, these peculiar clouds, and the chemtrails are being sprayed when these specific clouds appear.
The trails will go almost precisely through the center or geometric center of these formations. Uh-huh. What is the impetus for those formations? That's a fair question. Are they beings, or is it some technology that's creating this funky geometry, in the sky? Mm-hmm. And as soon as they show up, if not prior to their arrival, the trails are there, and these planes do target these objects. Mm-hmm. And whether that's so you can lace a powder in them and you can watch them evolve, or are you lacing this metallic powder in them so you can electrocute them, uh-huh, like you would a worm?
Right.
And I mean, because their awareness is going to be exceedingly limited. That's just how elementals are. They have a limited awareness, but can have a great presence. There's believe it or not, there is a dichotomy there. Mm-hmm. And so they can. My question is, what would happen to the storm if they would just leave it alone?
Right.
What would happen? And that's something that I struggle with, because the baseline of what the weather should be doing is lost. And I'm 47 years old. This started in 1976. I was 10. Mm-hmm. And so I don't have conscious memory of what things used to look like and how things used to behave. Mm-hmm. It's just not within my scope. It's not within my lifespan. I can look at old pictures and see these kind of clouds going back into the 1800s. So you'd assume that they're not a technology, but then again, we're all aware that this Earth has been visited for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And are there bases and intelligences that still have outposts and have operational technology, whether it's Earth alert systems so you can see what's going on in space, or who knows Who knows the extent of the ancient technology that is operating? And it may be that there is an aspect of weather modification, of weather technology, that is tens of thousands of years old. I have to allow for that. You know, when the Smithsonian National Geographic are not forthright about the history of humankind and what this planet has been through and what we as a species have been through, then it just leaves more questions than answers. And so, you know, there could be some very old stuff that is operational, and that's what, you know, we're trying to get a hold on it. So that's just another one of those cards that may lie in the deck that we get dealt now and again.
Well, I heard you use the term atmospheric surveillance. Can you talk a little bit more on this term?
I think that's a big part of why the trails are there, are to provide them surveillance of what all of this dust, what all these particles, what all of this is doing in the sky. And there are satellites in space. I mean, mainstream meteorologists use this as well, and they have a remote sensing capability that's called sounding. Essentially, they use sound waves, and they pulse the atmosphere, and they then bounce off to the Earth. And depending on the reactions or the reflections of this wave through the atmosphere, they can see, you know, where it's moving, what its humidity is, the composition, the temperature. You know, a lot of remote sensing can be done from space. And when you add this particulate matter to the atmosphere and essentially coat it, then there are layers, whether it's 18,000 feet for some of the lowest flying trails to 40,000 feet for some of the highest. These layers of the atmosphere then begin to scintillate or to become very, very clearly visible from space, from these satellites that are sounding the atmosphere doing remote sensing. And so I can see how it is a much better system than the ones that the National Weather Service uses, which are maybe 150 balloons launched twice a day, and then, you know, they float on off, pop, and then their instrument packages are captured. But otherwise, that's all the information from, you know, outside of other commercial or civilian aircraft that the Weather Service gets. Whereas the military-industrial complex, or whoever's running this, you know, has pretty much total information awareness of what is happening in the atmosphere via, you know, the trillions of particles that are up there floating.
Okay. All right. Now, we can't talk about the subject of chemtrails and not discuss the toxins emitted from these aerosols, such as aluminum, barium, ethylene dibromide, lead, mercury, and a whole laundry list of other dangerous ingredients. And, you know, inhaling these aerosols obviously puts a strain on the body, usually in the form of headaches, being fatigued, upper respiratory distress, even flu-like symptoms, and though we're not fully, you know, conclusive, you know, being affected with Morgellons disease. So now it's like we're in the arena of nano warfare waged upon us. What's your opinion on this, Scott?
Well, it's a great way to wage an asymmetric warfare.
Yeah.
Where you have a population that is ignorant of what they're under assault from,
right.
And because they don't know what they're under assault from, they don't know how to react. They don't know what diseases or what conditions, what syndromes that their bodies are demonstrating. And if you don't realize that every breath you take, that you're bringing more of this into your body, how do you then stay healthy? And we know that there are different mixtures in the trails. That's kind of a given. And I've seen, you know, planes flying side by side, one with a pink trail and one with a blue trail. I have seen, even as recently as last week, an airplane with each engine, one with a pink trail, one with a bluish-white trail. And so there's different mixtures for different purposes up there. And, you know, all we're doing is speculating. You know, so there's some reason why that they have this broad chemistry. And we're going to go back to surveillance, and then we'll hit the health stuff. But if they're up there sensing the atmosphere, looking for pockets of moisture, what's the temperature doing? What's the vertical motion? Vertical motion being very, very important for storm development, or downward motion to kill a storm. And these trails will undulate in the atmosphere and give them those readings. The other things the trails can do is really stay illuminated when there's very strong side shear happening. Mm-hmm. When part of the trail, let's just say it becomes a very strong S curve, will show up, and then the place where that curve begins and continues is bright, and then where it ends, the trail fades away very, very rapidly, mm-hmm. almost like it's cut off. And so there's other different conditions up there that the trails could be, let's just say, laid out there in very accurate, precise locations for them to derive that information from, mm-hmm. whether it's strictly for weather or other just atmospheric conditions. It's all data that goes back into their collection, because they truly wouldn't have flown a flight out there if they didn't need some data or something to be retrieved from that effort. They're not going to do it without some kind of a return.
You know what's interesting here is that I read some information from what I believe was from the research of Clifford Carnicom that mm-hmm. every organ in the body has a specific frequency, and if you disrupt that frequency electromagnetically, you create all sorts of health issues, including death. And you know what comes to mind here by coincidence, well, there are no coincidences in life, but what comes to mind here, Scott, are the undersea detonations conducted by the U.S. Navy and the affected sea life, such as whales and dolphins beaching themselves. You know, it's almost as if nature is giving us a clue. You know, this is going to be possibly you undergoing these effects if you don't speak up. You know?
That's possible. That's mm-hmm. certainly possible.
Yeah.
And we know that, you know, each individual organ has a resonant frequency. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the stomach, liver, heart, kidneys, skin tissue, all of those. And that research is, coming up on 100 years old, Wilhelm Reich and who's got the zapper? Hilda Clark.
Yeah.
Hilda Clark. So we understand, resonant frequency and how that can be healthy or inhibit, a person's well-being. Mm-hmm. Boom. Then we, go to Wi-Fi and some of those other signals, which are, 2.4 gigahertz is not something our organisms, resonate at, mm-hmm. but it's something we're subjected to daily. And so, we may be dealing with a technology that is using these resonances. I would tend to think the frequencies are much, much slower, much longer frequency than megahertz or kilohertz. I think we're just in the long wave, single hertz frequencies.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this. Do you have any understanding if these agencies that are involved, with these, chemtrails and so forth, I'm pretty certain you're aware that they know of the rejuvenating effects of the sun. It gives us vitamin D, it makes us, happy. There is this mood elevating element with being out in the sun. And
Agreed.
You talk about the mood engineering of the people. I've seen chemtrails being dumped in the air on a bright, sunny day, and say within an hour, probably less, the skies become overcast, and maybe people listening to this broadcast can relate to this, but I become withdrawn and depressed. All of a sudden it's nice, bright and sunny, and within about maybe an hour or less, it becomes, overcast and so forth. You want to share your thoughts on this?
I think social engineering moods is certainly one of the side effects of this. Europe has been, European winters have been brutal lately, utterly brutal since about 2009. They have been rough. Prague, Czechoslovakia, mm-hmm. last year, first 3 months, January, February, March, 90 mm-hmm. hours of sunshine.
Right.
That was their total. That's maybe 10 days, 10, 11 days worth of sunshine out of 3 months.
Wow.
And that changes moods. It changes people's outlook, on life and their interactions with others. I mean, it's a subtle form of engineering, but I think it has a big effect. Here in southern Colorado today, we started with sunshine, and then it trailed up, and we got cloudy for about 2-3 hours between 1, 2, 3 in the afternoon, and then it broke. It's cleared off, and we've got sun again.
Mm-hmm.
But you hate to have a sunny morning and then the afternoon is just lost. It's just lost, and it does. It happens over about that lunch hour. And then by 1 o'clock, you're losing 10-15% of the sunshine, and by 4 o'clock, 80% of it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of depressing days.
Right.
Because then the next day, the storm will arrive. The storm should be on site, and so you're not going to wake up with sunshine the next day if they're truly following regular patterns.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about weather wars here? I mean, it's my understanding that the weather is obviously being manipulated to destroy crops. In this case, with tornadoes, heavy rainfall, extreme drought. Um, ultimately in the long run, the farmer suffers because that's his form of income, obviously, is, providing, food for people and so forth. And then obviously, people like myself, who's, going to the market and buying, let's say, fresh fruit and vegetables, all of a sudden we see a, big increase in price because, the supply isn't there because of the heavy rainfalls or heavy frost and so forth. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, this is obviously a sick mentality, from these agencies doing this. Basically, it's creating famine in the long run, right?
That seems to be what's happening. It's but 1,000 cuts. Whether it's the incredible fires that are happening in Australia,
Mm-hmm.
and then after three decades and 2 generations, you've got farmers that could grow rice, that could grow orchards, and then they have to okay. And we used to be able to get 25-30 inches of rain a year, and now we get 12.
Mm-hmm.
What can we grow? What do we change? And so then they go to grapes
Mm-hmm.
because they're more of a desert plant. And if we want to blame it on climate change, that's one thing, or we can understand really what's going on and be proactive about it. That if drought is what is visiting your area more frequently, then that's what's going to be coming in the future,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they're showing you. So, it's farmers, and sometimes they get a crop in, they get flooded out,
Mm-hmm.
and then they've got to plant again.
Right.
What do? Do you have enough time for sorghum or for soybeans? Do you have to go to a shorter crop like sorghum? Or you're really short because it was a flood in late June and you have to do a quick wheat crop?
Mm-hmm.
These farmers, and then you got to come up with $125,000 to buy the seed from Pioneer
Mm-hmm.
or from whomever,
Right.
because they don't keep it in stock anymore. So farmers are on the front lines of this.
Mm-hmm.
Farmers and forestry. They're really on the front lines of this climate change.
Well,
However you want to look at it happening.
yeah, I mean, you can also talk about futures here. If you're hedging, let's say, in this case, if the price of orange juice will go up because the orange crop is going to be subjected to frost. I mean, you're obviously making a fortune right there, right?
Well, not necessarily. If you know the cold is coming, then you can buy your orange juice futures ahead of time.
Mm.
Lock in your price.
Mm-hmm.
But most people don't know that cold is coming until everyone knows at once.
Mm-hmm.
And I was lucky enough to do some agricultural forecasting in the early to mid '90s.
Uh-huh.
And these companies will pay nicely to get a 12, 18-hour lead on their competitors. Whether you're buying pipeline capacity, whether you're buying orange juice futures, grape juice futures, natural gas, availability. Natural gas has blown up in price in the East in the last 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
It was fairly steady, but then the cold just kept coming. More cold, more cold, more cold, and then all of a sudden, about 8 days ago, natural gas started to move from just about $3 per million BTUs to we're coming up on $6 per million BTUs now, and it's all because of the cold back here. Even with all of the fracking and all the natural gas production that's happening domestically, it still is having the weather's doubled the price of that fuel.
Wow. Okay.
And that's just for home heating purposes.
Yeah.
We're trying to, leverage natural gas for transportation and power production as well. So it's just the weather has an impact.
Right. Okay, well, I'd like to transition here and go into Orgon energy. I've read some of the work from Wilhelm Reich. Can you go into this topic, Scott? I'm pretty certain that some of our listeners would like to know more about this topic that you mentioned.
I'd like to have a meeting with that man too. I mean, he's certainly a wealth of knowledge. I'd love to have sit down with him first person, so he could really share some of his his personal understandings. Wilhelm Reich and Orgon energy. That was a discovery that he made serendipitously. He was in Maine in his workplace. And it was, kind of a hilly location, and he had some copper pipes that were sitting out on a workbench.
Mm-hmm.
But he noticed that they were pointing, or actually what he had noticed was that his pond, on a relatively still day, there was a little peaking, the little wave action that was happening out on the pond. And he's like, what is that happening? It's not fish below, it's not water, it's not something, it's not something physical. What is happening? This little small wave action to happen on a small spot. And the more he looked about it, he realized or saw that this copper tubing that he had out on his workbench was pointed at the pond of water.
Mm.
And so there was some kind of interaction happening between this long tubing and the water. And eventually he ended up calling these devices that were water-grounded copper tubing cooked to what was called BX piping or BX wiring, and then ground in water. And what was happening was ions were coming out of the tubes or being drawn into the tubes. He wasn't sure which. And then going into the water that he had his tubes grounded to. And so he called them cloud busters, but in reality they ended up being, or should have been, cloud accumulators. He had the polarity wrong. Mm-hmm. Instead of breaking something up, it was drawing in, and then accumulating, accumulating the ions, which then accumulate the water.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of his aha, his discovery. And then there's several years of, okay, now what do I do with this? How do I make this stronger? How do I focus? All of those other experiments that these discovering scientists kind of go through. Mm-hmm. But it was the life force. And as you begin to attract the ions, you begin to draw them to you. How do we tell the story? There's another man that came along after Reich and leveraged his knowledge. This man by the name of James Trevor Constable. And he got into it because he was using infrared photography to, take pictures of, what did he call them? Thingies in space, mm-hmm. beings, critters. But it was the life force energy that these beings were interested in. And that's how he was kind of catching them on the side after he was, doing his research into the Orgon field. And these beings were coming to Earth essentially to feed on the water, to drink the water. That was their energy. That was their sustenance. Was simply our water. And so the next guy that came along, James Trevor Constable, was using ionization tubes, maybe 6 foot long by maybe 4 inches wide, not a big thing. He could tuck these under a small Piper Cub airplane, something from the mid-50s, and then fly along the marine layer outside of Indonesia or off the coast of Hawaii, and they could turn over the atmosphere. They could what he called stir the ether. And with that, then thunderstorms would develop. He could never get the thunderstorms to develop exactly where they were. They would always be around the location or always around the site that they were doing the research. Mm. So that's why they determined or settled on having to have a moving target, a moving tool. The small plane with these tubes under the wings flying slowly was enough to get the rain and storms going. And so this is what I've seen in Colorado and Idaho, wherever I am. Out ahead of the storm, we're seeing these low-flying planes. They don't always have to have trails on board. Many of them don't, especially the ones that I'm seeing down here in southern Colorado. They don't have the trails. But my feeling is that the technology is on board those planes, and then the trails come along and then just gauge the efficiency and the activity that has happened prior to their arrival. So it's interesting. It's complicated. It's not as simple as trails impacting the weather. That's such a small part of it. That's such a very small part of it.
You know what popped into my head when you mentioned the life force was scalar energy, or in this case, the force as heard in the Star Wars franchise. You know,
force. Yeah, that's the etheric field.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Scott, how do we deal with our environment that day by day gets more and more hostile? It's hard trying to remain healthy and emotionally well. I mean, we're bombarded every day by stressful factors such as, well, as we talked about, chemtrails, environmental pollutants, the additives and preservatives in our food, fluoride in toothpaste and in our water supply, airborne microbes that we inhale, cell phone towers, the effects of Wi-Fi, microwave, warfare, the radiation from Fukushima, and I can go on and on. But do you have any pointers here as to what we can do for us to remain healthy and emotionally well?
Well, Martin, the simplest one and the one that will do you the most good is keep a good attitude. That is the biggest one. As soon as you get all worried about all these little things, each one of those concerns, each one of those worries, and you make a list of all these things that are bad for you, they're going to be bad for you. If you say they're bad for you, then they are bad for you. And so we almost create our own illness, our own disease, by going through and continuing to remind ourselves of all of these things that we're subjected to. It's like, we know it. Our body knows it. Our soul came into this reality, into this body, knowing what it was going to have to deal with, knowing the situation of the earth. Fukushima in 2011, that's been known. I mean, that has been known. So our future is more radioactive, period. We will evolve, period. It's how your attitude, you eat well, and there's other things we can do, and they're all natural and organic that will keep us healthy, keep our genes and genetics from drifting, to keep all these toxins from accumulating into the point to where we're not healthy and we develop tumors. It's water's a big one. Drinking clean, non-chlorinated, non-fluoridated water is a big one, because that really helps the body then flush away the toxins. And not many people get to drink and be raised, in particular, on that kind of clean water. I was fortunate that I didn't have to live on city water when I was growing up. We were on a well out in the country. And so I didn't have fluoride. I didn't have chlorine in my water until I went to college. It just wasn't there. And that's because if you can take care of those low-grade things, the fluoride, the chlorine, then your body can deal with some of the big things that come along. Whether you need to detox with diatomaceous earth or zeolites, or even go to smaller scale things like ormus and monatomics to deal with the Morgellons and the nano diseases. We have answers for everything. We really do. But you just have to keep yourself in a good place so these things, these other modalities have time to work. Because usually we don't start taking them until the body's in crisis. It's like, I need to go to the ER to detox. But we wait too long. We wait too long. We start being kind to ourselves.
Right. Okay, well, it's been stated that the Air Force wants to control the weather by 2025, and I strongly believe that they've already attained their agenda, as demonstrated by their psychopathic campaign to poison both the planet and its inhabitants. What are your opinions on this topic, Scott? It sounds as if we're karmically repeating the same scenario as ancient Atlantis. It's been stated that we are Atlanteans, but on a little bit of a higher level, so to speak. And I'm thinking that we're repeating the same karmic mistakes that they made, and obviously
I
they
would, I
paid
would
the
like,
price.
yeah. I would like to think we're as evolved as they are, but I'm not convinced.
Hmm.
I'm truly not convinced. I think we're probably a century or two shy of the level that they achieved.
Hmm.
We're just maybe the hidden government, the hidden people have reached that level, but that has not been shared with us. And yes,
Hmm.
cycles do repeat. They're not identical, but they do rhyme.
Uh-huh.
They do rhyme.
Hmm.
We go through a place in time where there's a high civilization, and then the cycle winds down, and then 12,000 years later, you're in a Bronze Age. You're where we have just come from, the
Hmm.
Dark Ages, the Middle Ages,
Hmm.
and then because that bottomed out 1500, and we're on a climb up ever since. And it's going to be a multi-thousand-year ascent, and then we'll go through a descent again. That's just the cycle.
Hmm.
So, we as human beings, we're older than this planet. You and I didn't begin here. This is just a brief stop on Earth, and then we're off to another adventure, another journey.
Hmm.
And so, this planet will continue on when we're gone, and we will leave.
Hmm.
We're not going to be here forever. That's for damn sure. We
Right.
will move on, and the planet will move on as well. Time, that is what time does. It just marches forward.
Hmm.
And so there are beings that are looking over this planet. She's in good hands. She's in good hands. If something needs to happen with humanity to smack it back and humble it, it will happen. And there's no doubt in my mind. There is a higher intelligence, a higher awareness, and it is so aware that it can listen on this conversation even as we speak.
Hmm.
That kind of awareness as to what is happening on this planet exists. And to think ourselves, the top of the pinnacle, that's just a little bit of arrogance.
Right.
So, yeah, we will cycle. Continents will sink and continents will rise, just as happened before.
Hmm.
And the continents that do rise, that'll be the land you'll want to move to. That's where we'll want to start again. That's where the soils will be lush. That's where the Garden of Eden will be. And that's where civilization will reemerge again.
Hmm.
That's just the cycle.
Okay, well said. Okay, Scott, we are approaching the end of the first hour here. Would you care to mention to the listening audience of your website and how anyone can reach you should they be interested in contacting you?
Sure. Weatherwars.info and Scott it used to be Scott at weatherwars.info. It's
Mhm.
weatherwars@gmail.com is the email, and then the other one is bluewateralchemy.com.
Mhm.
And that's we'll get to that in the next hour. But
Okay.
weather and meteorology, weatherwars.info, and most of what happens now is in Facebook or YouTube. That's kind of where we publish. That's where the social interaction is happening.
Right.
Is on those media sites. It's just it's just the way it's moving.
Just the way it is, huh? Okay.
That's the way it
Yeah.
is.
Well, you know what? I personally exploit these social media sites. I exploit these sites to promote the news that's not published or heard in either the newspaper or television. So there you
hmm
go. You know. Any closing comments you'd like to make for the audience, Scott?
Well, take some time and look up and familiarize yourself with what our sky really looks like these days.
Hmm.
It changes so quickly from minute to minute and hour to hour. And have this discussion with friends and family, gently, of course. One of those days when you've got the sky full of trails, just point it up and like, wow, look at all that. And don't say they're chemtrails, just call it pollution. Pollution, that's enough.
Hmm.
Then it isn't offensive and it isn't a new term that somebody has to integrate and try to figure out. It's just pollution. And once, we had a Clean Air Act because our pollution on the ground was so grotesque. There's no reason why we couldn't have a Clean Air Act for the atmosphere.
Hmm.
And so begin that discussion and have it in an open, listening, and receptive place.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time here to chat with me for the first hour, and I'll see you again for the second hour.
Sounds good. I'll be here.
Okay, thanks again, Scott. Take care, okay?
All right.
Good. hmm
Bye.
Goodbye. That's it for the first hour on As Above, So Below Radio. Tune in for the second hour by subscribing to holisticadvocate.com, where Scott will give his perspective on Ormus and the incredible properties that this substance bestows to one's health. Scott will also impart his experience using the Rick Simpson Phoenix Protocol. The rising disappearance of honeybees. Are they the proverbial canary in the coal mine, or is there hope? And is humanity poised for a promising future, and much more? You're listening to As Above, So Below Radio.